Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Welcome. It's good to see you all here on the first day of summer after our one day of spring. So you're inside. That makes you you're heroes in my book. It's fantastic, but a good reason to be here. So it's a pleasure today to introduce our speaker who's been lecturing all of this week, Earl Lewis, who is the inaugural director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan, president of the Organization of American Historians, professor of history and African American and African Studies at Michigan, and former president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, where I had the great pleasure and privilege of serving on the board with him and then working with him in his role as president as chair of the Mellon Foundation board. Before that, of course, he spent 8 years as provost at Emory and was the beloved dean of the Rackham Graduate School at Michigan. But for our tribe, the tribe in this room, the most important thing, of course, is his role as a distinguished scholar of African American history. This is what we always hold up the most. He is the author of the field-changing book In Their Own Interests and the prize-winning To Make Our World Anew, and of course, the important collaboration with Robin Kelley, the Young Oxford History of African Americans. The list of his books is long. There are many more, and I think you've probably heard about them on other days as well, so I'm not going to go through all of them. Suffice it to say, it's a great honor to have him here and to have this distinguished historian with us. In his first lecture, Earl shared stories of his youth in Norfolk, Virginia, which intersected with his uncle's experience in Central State Hospital there. I first learned about Central State myself at Mellon, where Earl supported an archival grant for the incredible records that he's now working with. And there was so much good work during Earl's time at Mellon of this kind, work that helped to build out the infrastructure of African American history in the country, in both its scholarly and its public form. So $10 million to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, support for Professor Gates's important documentary work.
Here to that.
Exactly. Support for Brian Stevenson's new slavery museum. Earl also achieved a remarkable diversification and broadening of Mellon's network of grantees. He brought in across the board smaller scale and younger cultural organizations. The Anchorage Museum for Native Art and Culture in Alaska, for example. Some smaller organizations for Asian American arts and culture in Southern California. The International Association of Blacks in Dance, and the Carpetbag Theater in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is a multi-generational ensemble company founded shortly after the inception of the Black arts movement, and that has endured all this time without a space of its own. It's really an extraordinary little organization. And Earl spread a commitment to programs in support of diversity throughout the foundation's work. He built on the justly celebrated Mellon Mays program to develop a parallel program in support of the professional development of curators from underrepresented backgrounds. He did the same sort of work, laying foundations for diversification for orchestras, symphonies, and a variety of other musical organizations. This is already a long list I've been giving you, and it's just the smallest subset of examples of the work that Earl did at Mellon to lift the infrastructure supporting African American history, art making, and cultural presence in this country to a new level. It's quiet work, philanthropy, actually. People don't often realize that. It's behind the scenes work, and it's the kind of work people don't always get all the credit for that they deserve. So we all owe Earl a huge debt of gratitude for that infrastructure lifting work, the building of presence throughout the country and our cultural landscape. Earl has constantly broken ground and set agendas on behalf of the cause of African American history, and these lectures are no different. Their topic, as you know, is mental health in Black communities. This has been a steady area of interest for Earl, reaching back to his uncle, of course, but also to his earliest years as an institutional leader. So years ago at Michigan, he helped found the nation's first Center for the Study of Depression. The topic is pressing across the country, but also here, as you all know. Our own campus's recent task force report on inclusion and belonging called out the need for campus health services to step up their game in addressing the mental health needs of a diverse community. And the issue was driven home for us just a couple of weeks ago in the recent arrest and beating of a Black student on campus, where the student's encounter with the Cambridge police began with a call for help to university health services. Something's clearly awry in how the mental health needs of Black communities are being addressed. And so it's a terrific thing to have Earl here helping to set up that agenda, using history to help us from a distance in the lens of comparison and contrast, think about our present. Today he pivots to humor, to a lecture called When Humor is the Answer. And I'm eager to hear what he has to say on the question, but I can't resist invoking Ralph Ellison, who had many wonderful things to say on the subject. So I want to read just a bit from him to underscore how important the theme is before inviting you all to listen to Earl. So from The World and the Jug. Being a Negro American has to do with the memory of slavery and the hope of emancipation and the betrayal by allies and the revenge and contempt inflicted by our former masters after the Reconstruction, and by the myths, both Northern and Southern, which are propagated in justification of that betrayal. It involves, too, a special attitude toward the waves of immigrants who have come later and passed us by. It has to do with a special perspective on the national ideals and the national conduct, and with a tragic comic attitude toward the universe. And in that same pain, that same pleasure, Ellison writes, our Negro situation is changing rapidly, but so much which we've gleaned through the harsh discipline of Negro American life is simply too precious to be lost. I speak of the faith, the patience, the humor, the sense of timing, the rugged sense of life, and the manner of expressing it, which all go to define the American Negro. These are some of the things through which we've confronted the obstacles and meannesses of which you speak, and which we dare not fail to adapt to changed conditions, lest we destroy ourselves. Times change, but these possessions must endure forever, not simply because they define us as a group, but because they represent a further instance of man's triumph over chaos. That's what Earl is talking about tonight. So welcome, it's an honor and a pleasure.
Good afternoon, everyone. This room is nice and intimate, and it seems appropriate as we start talking about humor, and that we're all in close contact with one another. Thank you. It's all mic. First, Daniel, thank you for that very lovely introduction and for setting the stage for today's conversation. This is 3 days in, and so I look around the room and I see some faces that have been sitting in one chair or another for the last 3 days, and so thank you for your endurance and your willingness to not only come once or twice, but thrice to engage in this conversation. It's deeply appreciated. Skip, thank you again for the invitation. As I alluded to a few days ago, this was a couple of years in the making. We tried a few dates, and my calendar and everyone else's calendar is a complicated thing to align, but it finally happened, and here we are, and indeed, we have a glorious day of spring. And I noted family and friends in the audience the other day, but I wanted to use this last lecture to call out Susan Whitlock, my wife, who has been a collaborator in this conversation in one form or another. We not only have bounced ideas, she's the perp editor, so she's been pushing me to challenge me to clarify what it is I was saying, which is lucky to have in all kinds of respects, all the more so when you're trying to actually talk about something that is as challenging as mental illness and mental health, and doing it from a historical perspective when you realize that one can imagine a whole raft of sources, but they don't always provide you with the answers to the questions you truly want to pose, and so you then left on your own to try to answer them. So let's begin. On the eve of the nation's bicentennial celebration, the spectacularly witty and often profane comic Richard Pryor put into words what Black Americans had often said about and to one another. That nigger's crazy. Pryor's 1974-75 album, which earned him a Grammy for comedy, poked fun at race, racism, crazy people, and American social relations. It helped secure Pryor's reputation as one of the nation's comic geniuses and as a biting critic of the ordinary in American life. He became the characters in his skits. His verbal descriptions were so well drawn, they provided visual cues of the text, context, and subtext of life in the United States in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, I just, for a second, I can still, I don't know how many of you remember the one where he was talking about his girlfriend who was leaving and the dog who was actually going with the girlfriend, but he and the dog has a conversation, and you can almost see Richard and his dog having a conversation when the dog decides, you know, man, I'm going to leave you a little something over here to remember me by. It's sort of the punchline in Pryor, and you sort of sit there and you think you're driving along the freeway, and all of a sudden there's Richard Pryor 8-track, and all of a sudden you almost have to pull off to the side of the road because you're laughing along the way and you realize you're a little distracted.
He said kind of tardy with the food.
A little, yeah, exactly, he did. For example, Pryor knew all too well that years of unequal social interactions made police officers in black communities symbols of fear. He played on that irony in his skit. He knew, too, that in the early 1970s, social relations between black men and white women provoked unease and hostility in both black and white America, as they have since the settling of North America. Again, such ordinariness provided exceptional fodder for the comic. Pryor even understood that the accident of birth that landed you in a black household came with not only heartaches, but tangible mercies. Early on in the album, after joking about sexual relations, sexual inexperience, lessons learned and ignored, and money and racial indifferences, he told his audience, white people don't play enough. They don't know how to play the dozens. Playing the dozens, as many of us know, was an African-American ritualized game of insult. It allowed the physically small to challenge the perceptibly more powerful through the clever use of humor and ridicule. It was also a narrative about shifting the vectors of power in social relations, a way for African Americans to learn that through skill and hard work, power could be subverted. Yet Pryor never flinched from exposing the routine kind of arbitrariness that separated blacks and whites in American life. At one point, he conjured up a hard-working, working-class black guy who made $120 a week and cleared $80 after taxes. The character goes out with his wife to relax and have a good time. While driving, he is pulled over by the police since he fits the general description of a black perpetrator. During the encounter, he is told to get out of the car, drop his pants, and spread his cheeks. Here, Pryor forces us to confront the emasculation of black men and the hurt, humiliation, anger, and alienation that is part of these daily dealings. The psychological toll is devastating, and Pryor lets us know of his unseen consequences when he riffs on the character. After that, you go home, beat your kids. You're going to take this out on somebody. The title of Pryor's album was self-referential. Anyone listening to the rawness of his skits walked away mostly laughing, perhaps shaking their head, and most likely agreeing with the album's refrain. He's crazy. Pryor observed few boundaries, and his characters seemed all so real. Yet the humor could serve as both a release and a mask. As a release, laughing in the face of adversity had long served to minimize the psychologically damaging effects of first slavery and then segregation. As a mask, humor allowed pain to be deflected, enabled the jokester to hide behind a laugh rather than succumbing to a cry. For more than a century, African-American intellectuals have recognized this. James Weldon Johnson, noted writer, activist, musician, diplomat, and sophisticate, made this very point when reflecting on his summer job teaching students in rural Georgia during the 1890s. Johnson had grown up in Jacksonville, Florida, and his summer sojourns into the backwoods of Georgia doing breaks from study at Atlanta University brought him into closer contact with rural people, rural blacks, in closer contact than he had known before. He would write, the situation in which they were might have seemed helpless, but they themselves were not without hope. The patent proof of this was their ability to sing and laugh. I know something about the philosophy of song. I wish I knew as much about the philosophy of laughter. Their deep, genuine laughter often puzzled and irritated me. Why did they laugh? How could they laugh so? Was this rolling, pealing laughter merely echoes from a mental vacuity, or did it spring from an innate power to rise above the ironies of life? Or were they, in the language of a line from one of the blues, laughing to keep from crying? Were they laughing because they were only thoughtless? Were they laughing at themselves? Were they laughing at the white man? End quote. Behind Johnson's words lurks the underbelly of humor. Left with no other way to overcome the clear power disparities and the arbitrary nature of life, especially as noted yesterday when we talked about fear and terror that had enveloped their world. Black Americans could descend into anger and frustration and violence and alcoholism, drug use, depression, and more acute forms of mental illness. Laughter could not prevent the wounds inflicted by life in a racist society, but it could serve as a balm to salve those wounds. It was when they were left untreated and allowed to fester that more serious consequences could result. Richard Pryor came of age at a time when the veil of the color line had begun to lift, exposing more non-blacks to the ways in which humor had been used to invert the system that could lead to mental and social breakdowns. Nearly 3/4 of a century before Pryor addressed his San Francisco audience, the noted social scientist and cultural critic W.E.B. Du Bois juxtaposed the phrases, the color line and the veil, to summarize life in a hyper-racialized world. In his classic text, The Soul of Black Folk, Du Bois offered that the problem of the color line would be the defining challenge for America in the 20th century, and that America's introduction of rigid segregation produced a veil that made African Americans largely invisible to whites. Absent a fully informed understanding of the other, whites in this instance painted their own portraits of blacks, ones that emphasized criminality, depravity, backwardness, and ones that justified second-class status. Blacks, in turn, attempted to craft their own narratives about themselves and the whites they encountered. It was not until the 1970s, with the appearance of a generation of comics represented by Pryor, that the veil lifted significantly. Yet, for much of the 20th century, African Americans used humor to critique race and racism and combat mental illness. This lecture begins the process of understanding the connection between race, humor, and mental health behind the veil of segregation. It maps the way humor both highlighted the mental anguish associated with life in Jim Crow America and the ways in which that same humor worked to counteract racism's brutalizing effects. This story of race, humor, and mental health in the United States has its origin, of course, in slavery. For most Americans of African descent, Jim Crow represented the extension of a theme rather than the introduction of an entirely new context. Slavery in the Americas, which lasted for more than 4 centuries, took devastating tolls. In agricultural work, specific outcomes depended on the crop. Colonial countries such as Britain, Spain, and Portugal learned as early as the 16th century the lucrative profits to be made from sugar cultivation. As a multi-day crop, sugar, for example, required more than 365 days to plant, grow, cultivate, and prepare for market. Studies have shown that the exhaustive regime for sugar workers required a high caloric intake, an investment few planters chose to make. Through the 19th century, the profits from sugar were so great and access to a steady supply of African labor so available that humans became disposable. It was cheaper throughout much of the colonial era to buy another human than to adequately feed the one you had. As a result, Jamaica, Barbados, and much of Brazil replenished their slave populations through constant importation rather than through natural increase. Only growing opposition to the slave trade in the 19th century reversed this long-established pattern. By contrast, British colonial North America relied less on the production of a single high-profit staple such as sugar, and instead produced a variety of products for the Atlantic slave system, which brought finished products to Africa, slaves to the Americas, and raw goods to Europe. Through the third decade of the 19th century, with a couple of interruptions, slavery existed in what became the United States, both North and South. In the North, enslaved Africans were stevedores, domestic help, farmhands, fishermen, and sailors, and in sundry industries. Except along the docks, most labored in settings where their numbers were small and working relations with their owners were intimate. Until the advent of mass cotton plantations in the early 19th century, Southern slaves worked the same range of jobs in the North as well as on tobacco, rice, and a few sugar plantations and farms. Through the 1770s, tobacco, rather than sugar, emerged as the most lucrative market staple crop in Maryland, Virginia, and parts of the Carolinas. Regardless of the region, the brutality of the work requirements did not produce the same demographic results in North America as they had in the Caribbean and South America. Fewer Africans were brought to the United States by the end of the 19th century. More individuals of African descent resided there, however, than any other place in the Americas. Influenced by the literature then on the devastating effects of life on concentration camps during World War II, a post-war generation of historians took a new look at the institution of North American slavery and concluded, nonetheless, that it was a totalizing system. And I talked about this a little bit yesterday. Yet, it was never a completely defining institution. In fact, slavery produced a spectrum of lived experiences and reactions. In some places, from sundown to sunup, men, women, and children gathered to share stories, food, prayer, laughter, song, and cry, and to cry, make love, and fret about the vagaries of life under this institution. Those scholars responding to historian Stanley Elkin's thesis that African Americans so internalized their subordinate status as to become childlike never ignored the harshness or capriciousness of everyday life in the slave economy. They knew the threat of sexual exploitation hung over every black female from the taking of her first until the taking of her last breath. They understood the profit motive meant that familial ties for most blacks had little standing before the law, since chattel was property to be sold, moved, and removed at the pleasure of planters and their creditors. But they also understood slavery differed from the colonial period through the antebellum period, from north to south, from farm to plantation, from city to countryside, and from staple to staple. In the most recent 2 generations of historians writing about the peculiar institution knew that the children of Africa who made America their home helped make America as well. Rather than coming as blank slates devoid of cultural bearings, they brought their African culture with them, cultures plural with them, pieces of identity that live on in the names they call themselves, the religions they practiced, the food they cultivated and cooked, the jokes they told, the ceremonies they crafted, and the worldview they created. It is also clear that slavery at its very worst exacted a toll on both blacks and whites. The arrogance of racism meant any black man or woman could become the property of any white man or woman at any time, even if the black person had papers proclaiming free status. The constant threat of subordination without much recourse had an effect. At the same time, any white person, no matter how humble their status, knew they occupied a rung or two up the social ladder above even the most prosperous African American. This kind of hyper-social elevation, no doubt, took a toll on whites and their psyches, surfacing in some a disconnect between the privilege of being white and the material limits that whiteness brought them. As a result, throughout much of American history, in the main, we are reminded that race trumped class. Perhaps because of the arrogance of race, which rendered their intelligence invisible to whites, African Americans found some mental space for themselves over 3 centuries that might not be immediately apparent. Close proximity to whites, as jokes, folktales, and other remnants of an American slave record show, helped one generation of enslaved people teach another how to survive, while poking fun at their supposed superiors. Larry Levine's classic study, Black Culture and Black Consciousness, makes this point in several ways. Levine details the ways in which enslaved peoples use animal tales, especially trickster tales, to instruct children about the vectors of power that shape daily dealings. Trickster tales were prominent features of African folk traditions. Transferring and transmuting those tales to an American context paralleled the movement of the peoples who survived the Middle Passage. The spider, the hare, a rabbit, the fox, the tortoise, the bear, and a wide assortment of other animals made up a panoply of characters in these tales. Levine notes, and I quote, "Although the range of slave tales was narrow in neither content nor focus, it is not surprising that the tales most easily and abundantly collected were animal trickster tales. Because of their overwhelmingly paradigmatic character, animal tales were, of all the narratives of social protest or psychological release, among the easiest to relate both within and especially outside the group," end of quote. While a story might come in the form of animal tales, aside from children, few inside the slave community mistook them for anything other than stories about humans and the human condition. Quote, The world the animals lived in, the rules they lived by, the emotions that governed them, the status they craved, the taboos they feared, the prizes they struggled to attain were those of the men and women who lived in this world. Some tales chronicled how the average animal, while duped once or twice by his more intellectually powerful neighbor, persevered and ultimately usurped the authority of the more powerful. Others focus on making do with what one has, small stature, average intellect, and limited physical strength, to live, love, and endure another day. The tales were cultural lesson plans, teaching successive generations how to do more than merely survive. They offered a realistic glimpse into the precariousness of life in a system that assumed power flowed unequally. By the 1930s and 1940s, folk tales with animal characters faded in use as a more direct storytelling approach to the human situation marked a new dimension of the African American experience in America. Humor's place in the storytelling arsenal of African American commentators did not change, however. Jokes, tales, comments, jabs, lyrics, all of them made fun of family and friends, fun of foes and adversaries, fun of the ordinary and the extraordinary, fun. But behind the laughter and the incisive commentary was also a deeper story, one that lasered in on the psychological effects of life and society where race mattered so much. Through humor, African Americans ensured a subtle yet profoundly important distinction between what it meant to be victimized without considering oneself merely a victim. To be victimized without considering oneself merely a victim. To understand those effects, this talk then goes on, and I will, to examine jokes and stories told during the period of the 1920s to the 1950s. Life in the Jim Crow America taught both blacks and non-blacks lessons about power, expendability, and subordination. Misreading the scripts, as we talked about yesterday, could prove deadly for blacks. And as a way of covering the travails of black life, its ups and downs, noted author, lyricist, and poet Langston Hughes produced his character, Jesse B. Simple. Simple often voiced in biting satire what many blacks thought, even if they didn't dare utter those thoughts aloud. Typical was a simple story entitled, "There Ought to Be a Law." In it, Simple tells a friend that he thinks a preserve should be established for black Americans. How, the friend demands to know, had he come up with such a fantastical idea? Simple offers, and I quote, "A movie I saw the other night about how the government is protecting wildlife, preserving fish and game and setting aside big tracts of land where nobody can fish, shoot, hunt, nor harm a single living creature with furs, fins, or feathers. But it did not show a thing about Negroes." Like his friend and most of black Americans who came of age in the Jim Crow era, Simple there was a daily reminder of the precarious nature of life, especially if you lived in the South. He would go on to observe, "The government protects and takes care of the buffalo and the deer, which is more than it does for me and my kinfolk down south." After recounting an atrocity or two, reflecting on the corporate physical and emotional burden of navigating the assorted laws, customs, practices, and beliefs that attempted to define and constrain blacks, he goes on to opine, "Congress ought to set aside some place where we can go, and nobody can jump on us and beat us, neither lynch us, nor Jim Crow us every day. Colored folk rate as much protection as a buffalo or a deer." You can see in reading this and in a way how humor becomes its own way of not only analyzing but offering this sort of powerful critique of the situation. Langston Hughes understood the brutalizing effects of contemporary race relations in the United States. He knew that you didn't need to lynch every black man in the South or woman to terrorize a whole people. He understood that humor could provoke a momentary relief from the most subtle forms of oppression, even as the same humor exposed the weight of racism on the individual's mental health. As his biographer, Arnold Rappersad, noted, Hughes first introduced Jesse B. Simple, or later just Simple, in 1943 to readers of the Chicago Defender, and through syndication and publication of that column to millions of others. Plain-spoken, reflective, incisive, defensive, critical, and at times alienated, Simple spoke for millions of others who too serve as keen critics of their world. Yet, despite a deep understanding of Hughes and the character he introduced, Rampersad's emphasis is other than Simple's use of humor to outline the cost of life in Jim Crow America. And so I want to pull a little bit about the humor side as we take what was developed. And there ought to be a law. Hughes makes the need for freedom to be oneself without interference or prejudice quite clear. Simple tells his more urbane interlocutor, if the government can set aside some spot for an elk to be an elk without being bothered, or a fish to be a fish without getting hooked, or a buffalo to be a buffalo without being shot down, there ought to be some place in this American country where a Negro can be a Negro without being Jim Crowed. Yearning for the freedom to be oneself jumped from Simple's lips into the collective psyche of Hughes's many readers. Here, unlike any earlier trickster tales, the humor did little to cloak the real message. Racism was not only burdensome, it was ridiculous. If segregation was designed to separate blacks from whites, then perhaps the most logical extension of that idea was a truly separate place in America, modeled on a game reserve that came with its own protections, assurances, and understandings. Maybe then the inalienable rights proclaimed in the Constitution could be realized. And you can see Hughes playing with a whole full repertoire of sort of language and narrative there to sort of look at not only the irony of American life, but all of its sort of simple ways of being ridiculous. Hughes allowed Simple to venture into social discussions that many blacks found exceptionally dangerous during the Jim Crow era. Indicative of this daringness was a story or article titled Race Relations. It's one of my favorite ones, the way he played with it. Interracial marriage prompted prohibitions from both black and whites during this period, yet the nation was peopled with black and whites with common forebears. That skip is documented more than once. Simple uses the occasion of the creation of a circa 1946 Race Relations Committee to prick sensibilities and probe multiple meanings of relations, quotation marks, particularly race relations. He tells his friend in one exchange, them colored papers are full of stuff about race relations committees functioning all over the country and how they are working to get rid of the poll tax and to keep what few Negroes still have jobs from losing them and such. But insofar as I can tell, none of them committees is taking up the real problem of race relations. Because I always thought relations meant being related. Don't it? And to be related, you have to have relations. Don't you? I'll sit there on that one for a second. Here, Simple barges in on the forbidden terrain of interracial marriage and interracial sexual relations. Throughout the South, such arrangements were not only taboo, but expressly forbidden by law. To circumvent the law, whites who were willing had to commit race suicide by becoming, in effect, black. And blacks who were fair enough to pass had to endure the perpetual fear of being uncovered. Simply boldly calls for neither suicide nor passing. He simply asserts that race relations minus relations skirt the possibility of real equality. When challenged by his friend about whether he desires to be with and marry a white woman, Simple quips, I do not, but I figure some white women might want to marry me. Then to parry other known objections and an important response to a friend, he says, I do not see why it should infuriate the South. But it's because the South has always done more relating than anybody else. There are more light-skinned Negroes in the South whose pappy was a white man than there is in all the rest of this whole America. Simple goes on to explain that despite his dark hue, he too has some white blood. His friend reasonably replies, that is not what the race relations committees are concerned with. Simple's version of race relations are best understood as private matters, this friend begins to assert. But Simple gets the last word on what are true race relations. Hughes's ability to impart humor to this repartee between two intellectual foes arguing over the day's headlines should not be taken for granted. Since the end of the 19th century, books, sermons, plays, movies, and political harangues invoke the image of the brutish black man who wanted nothing more than to be with a white woman. In common telling, the white woman, virginal often, but virtuous always, never desired the black male. She was always the victim of his predatory ways. The power of this trope justified legal and extra-legal action across this nation. By the 20th century, most lynchings of blacks in the South were justified by alleged black-on-white rapes, and most northern race riots between 1910s and the 1940s stemmed from the claims of such assaults and improprieties. Behind Hughes's humor and use of satire stands a powerful corrective. When Simple suggests that perhaps he would not be the one desiring, but the one desired, he presents white women as sexual actors with their own wants. Wants that, like any human response, refuse to be policed by what others, white men or others, might prefer. Thus, Hughes, through Simple, attempted to liberate the discussion of race relations from a limited focus on state-sanctioned public acts, such as the poll tax and limits on voting, to consider the deeper meaning of human relations. Jim Crow existed as a tool of empowerment and subjugation because the population could be easily subdivided into racial categories: white, black, red, brown, and yellow. The first drop rule favored the white majority because it only took one drop of non-white blood to make you a racial minority. If, as Simple intimates, relating involves intermarrying, the power of the one-drop rule would lose its saliency and human relations would trump race relations. I realize I may have to change that use of Trump in the future. Race, especially during the Jim Crow era, had deeply affecting consequences for both blacks and whites. Against the backdrop of a world war predicated on racial difference, psychologists such as Thomas Pettigrew and Kenneth and Mamie Clark reminded Americans that its horrible effects were not limited to the victims of Nazis in Germany. Pettigrew focused on the effects of prejudice on the mental health of minority and majority populations, while the Clarks went directly into the black community to ask kids to evaluate perceptions of self-worth. They centered on the internalization of racism. Spend a second here to talk about Kenneth and Mamie Clark. The Clarks first came to the attention of social analysts in 1940 after the publication of their article, Segregation as a Factor in the Racial Identification of Negro Preschool Children. It's an article appeared in the Journal of Experimental Education. Using fairly rudimentary questions, they found that Negro children between the ages of 3 and 7 in communities as different as Philadelphia, Boston, Worcester, and towns across Arkansas preferred the white dolls to the brown-skinned dolls. As important, the doll studies showed that Negro children developed race consciousness as early as 3 and the associated negative attitudes. While internalized racism may not itself deserve the label of mental illness, we can certainly say it was not conducive to mental health. The Clarks, as well as future Nobelist Gunnar Myrdal, concluded that perceptions of inferiority plagued African Americans, but also that perceptions of superiority overwhelmed whites. Blacks had long traded on this knowledge. The belief in white omnipotence blinded white Americans in some of their dealings with blacks. This was not only the secret to the trickster tales discussed earlier, but the twist on which African American jokes are quite often turned. For example, Randall Albert Carter, a bishop in the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, self-published a book of humor in Cincinnati in 1923 entitled Canned Humor. One of his jokes poked fun at the progenitor of the idealized happy plantation day genre, Thomas Nelson Page. Page had deep roots in Virginia, as many of you know, tracing his family to colonial Jamestown. A prominent lawyer in Richmond who overcame impoverishment after the Civil War to gain considerable stature and status, He would not only go on to popularize the idea of the contented slaves and happy slaves and masters in novels and stories, he would serve as an ambassador to Italy during the Wilson administration. To make light of Page's own racial arrogance, Carter related the following tale. And I'm quoting, Thomas Nelson Page tells of an office boy named Eugene and colored, whom he had when he practiced law in Richmond. The boy wasn't much of a help about the office, but with proper persuasion, he could be induced to sweep out every morning. One day, however, he did not appear. Page went to the office, saw it was not swept, and went out and walked around for an hour. He waited another hour, and still no boy. He waited until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and no boy. So, very angry, he decided to go out and interview the boy's father about it. And then this is in dialect. That rascally boy of yours hasn't been at my office at all today, exploded Page. Surely, Master Tom, replied the father. You ain't telling me that boy Eugene hadn't been there yet. I'm telling you, he hasn't been there at all today. That's very strange, commented the father, but I reckon you'll have to excuse him this morning. Excuse him? Why? Roared Page. Well, Master Tom, he's dead. Yeah. The death of a child has long been recognized as one of the most difficult losses to accept. Depression, anger, anxiety, frustration, hopelessness, and at times confusion have plagued parents who have experienced it. In this story, in a world in which the thin line separating servitude and servility determined the social space between blacks and whites, a father's grief perforce comes second to the wants of a powerful and prominent white man. Here, the father has no space to come out and tell Page the truth. His son is not lazy. His son has died. Instead, the father defers to the man of letters and law, allowing Page to continue the ruse of being himself superior in all respects. Page never stops to ask the father if Eugene is okay, since he is not shown for work in the morning. But if Page assumes the son has shirked his duties and the father hasn't come out and said, I'm sorry to say my son has died, the punchline rights the situation, both allowing the father to name his loss and poking fun at the arrogance of the more powerful. Through humor, African Americans attempted to show that the arrogance of race could rob whites of the most fundamental of human emotions, empathy. As a result, whites appeared morally underdeveloped and psychologically truncated. In this story and countless others, humor did something more. It freed the teller and the audience to laugh. Laughter, we know from recent studies, alters the body's chemistry and changes the brain's activation. It also allows individuals to escape the immediacy of their situation and provides an opportunity to release terror. Think of why we laugh at horror movies or after a sudden plunge on a roller coaster. Sometimes it is just a realization we survived a horrific moment. Humor at other times requires no more than the ability to tell a story in a manner that unveils what is laughable. In the process, humor and laughter help promote mental well-being too. Humor proved helpful not only in dealing with the codification of racism externally, but also with internalized racism. For instance, the word black held much negative meaning during the Jim Crow era, so much so that its ubiquity in contemporary parlance belies the heavy weight it carried a generation or two before. Before the 1960s, when James Brown shouted, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," the words colored and Negro were preferred in many African American communities. Black was viewed as a pejorative, as much of a fighting word as the N-word. After all, black denoted the negative in the everyday vocabulary of most Americans, which all standard definitions and all standard dictionaries of the time confirmed. There was black male, black listed, black bald, and black magic, black market, and a black heart. Even a black cat signaled bad luck. Langston Hughes' character, Simple, wrestled with the word black long before the Black Power movement. Through Simple, Hughes interrogated the psychological burdens of being identified with a negative. Without saying it directly, Simple puzzles over the ways a word could so negatively affect how people interpreted their world. Before he's able to answer his own question, he is confronted by the absurdity of it all. After the atrocities of the Holocaust and findings of various commissions, how can anyone argue about basic civil rights for American citizens and not include black Americans as citizens? He would go on. Yet, in his simple voice, he would say, white folks have used that word to mean something bad so often until now that when the NAACP asks for civil rights for the black man, they think they must be bad. Simple and his friend agreed on the odious use of black and its effects on the mental well-being of those inhabiting a black skin, and pondered what the world would look like for African Americans if black connoted positive attributes and white negative ones. Simple. Wait till my day comes. In my language, bad will be white. Black male will be white male. Black cats will be good luck, and white cats will be bad. In Simple's world, it would be okay to call someone black because black would denote good. The two characters portray the heavy burden of embodying all that was negative, that is Simple and his friend, and imply it destroyed the soul, the psyche, the individual, and at times parts of the community. Without the benefit of the social science method pioneered by the Clarks, Hughes picked on a theme of individual and collective injury, and through his poignant use of humor betrayed the mental health burden of life behind the veil. Through Simple's voice, he would conclude this satirical examination of Americans' contradictions with the following. I am black. When I look in the mirror, I see myself, Daddy-O, but I am not ashamed. God made me. He made F.D., Frederick Douglass, dark as he is. He did not make us no badder than the rest of the folk. The earth is black, and all kinds of good things come out of the earth. Everything that grows comes up out of the earth. Trees and flowers and fruit and sweet potatoes and corn and all that keep men alive come up right out of the earth. Good old black earth. Coal is black, and it warms your house and cooks your food. The night is black, which has a moon and a million stars, and is beautiful. Sleep is black, which gives you rest, so you wake up feeling good. I am black. I feel very good this morning. What is wrong with black? The last question placed in sharp relief the suppleness of humans' ability to intervene in the age of Jim Crow. For Simple, the question of what was wrong with black was rhetorical, surely. Black readers understood Simple looked in the mirror and saw a self he appreciated, and we are left to assume love. For much of white America, the question, however, invited a response. They would have seen in Simple's reflection much to reject, and would have found Hughes' use of storytelling, satire, and humor at best off-putting and at worst threatening to their view of the world. Before black could become a word with great acceptance and wide valiance, it had to be uncloaked, disarmed, and made less fearful. Jokes and humor were like an advanced force in a campaign for liberation. Only this time, the battleground was not a military field, but rather a social field in which the minds and souls of the captured would be set free. Eventually, black would not only replace colored Negro in other words, it would convey pride, power, and beauty. Each contributed to a healthier sense of self and well-being. Of course, not all of African-American humor during this period dealt with the power of race to shape lives and limit options. Sometimes blacks told jokes about other dimensions of the human experience. Few spent all their waking moments thinking about either their white neighbors or segregation. They loved and joked and lived, frequently focusing on the details of the most intimate interactions with others in their community. Among the things we find as they forged community was a healthy degree of competition. Neighborhoods competed, schools competed, social organizations and fraternal orders competed, so did churches and lodges and families. Sometimes the range of that competition pitted children against each other. The following joke from the 1920s captures the range of rivalry and demonstrated the ways humor helped to mute rejection. It's entitled In Her Favor. First little girl, your papa and mama are not your real parents. They adopted you. Second little girl, well, that makes it all the more satisfactory. My parents picked me and yours had to take you just as you came. I like that one. A child's sense of well-being derives in part from a secure sense of belonging. Adoption, rejection by birth parents, and acceptance by adoptive parents. The first line in this joke functions as a powerful, even mean-spirited reminder of the initial rejection. We have no way of knowing how deeply painful such a reminder may have been. But the quick rejoinder spins the critique around. Here, humor reveals a possible hurt in the power of parental rejection and shows how out of one chapter of hurt can come a fuller story of love and acceptance. Spontaneously or after careful deliberation, adults and even children devise ways of mobilizing humor to reassert their humanity and spare themselves moments of emotional pain. Such was the use of humor by even the youngest. Such was humor's role in protecting the mental health of those behind the veil. Yet, there was no full escape of Jim Crow's ubiquitous presence in the period between 1920 and 1960. Perhaps that is why Langston Hughes often found himself returning to the dual themes of race and humor. In story after story, Simple dreams of a day when Jim Crow would disappear and of ways he can hasten its demise. In some, he is granted omnipotent power sufficient to force change and bring the segregationist South to his knees. In others, he chastises churches for openly supporting the status quo. Sometimes Simple wishes the world would let him be black, working class, and ordinary. On other occasions, he seeks a world that takes note of his accomplishments and heralds his existence. But more than anything, the hundreds of stories show a man who is anything but simple. A man who understands the power of words to redirect conflict, smooth old hurts, and promise a new day. Hughes' stories were born of the experiences of millions, men and women, often taught like James Weldon Johnson's country folk, to laugh at the absurdity of life. A way of thinking about this is a story that comes from Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Marshall will share this with legal scholar Mark Tusnick in a 1989 interview. The setting was Columbia, Tennessee in 1946. The war was over, and the Double V campaign to end tyranny abroad and Jim Crow at home was picking up momentum and opposition. In this Tennessee community, whites asserted their rights to affirm the social order. Blacks countered. When a physical confrontation between a black youth and a white grocer resulted in a march on the town's black quarters, a mutual exchange of gunfire precipitated a race riot involving the National Guard. Marshall and the NAACP was called in to defend the black residents. Now, life on the road for an NAACP lawyer in the South during this era came with all kinds of hazards. Marshall recalled that he returned to Columbia, Tennessee in a trial after a 6 weeks absence due to a lingering virus. While driving one night with a local lawyer, Z. Alexander Luby, he was pulled over by the police. After hassling them, the police eventually arrested Marshall for driving while drunk. Now, Marshall was a known drinker. But on this time, he had not imbibed for 2 days. That didn't deter the cops. They took him to a local magistrate, a professional teetotaler, who served as a human breath analyzer. After instructing Marshall to breathe on him, which Marshall eagerly did, the man declared Marshall sober. Once he escaped the clutches of the Columbia cops, he was spirited away in a car other than the one he had shared with Luby. Marshall eventually made his way to Nashville. There he called Attorney General Tom Clark. This is how Marshall explained the conversation. Quote, "So I told him, and he said, 'Well, were you drunk?' I said, 'No. But exactly 5 minutes after I hang up this phone, I'm going to be drunk.'" You can almost hear Marshall laughing. A laugh ripe with the understanding he had just escaped with his life. And that in some ways, I'm laughing because I can be here and I can talk about this. But they were out to kill me. I know they were out to kill me. And in fact, he would say this in the testimony. It was only because of a little ingenuity and a whole range of folks. And in fact, what I don't say here is Luby and others kept following the police so they couldn't take him off on the side road alone. He survived. He laughed. He probably did have more than one drink that night. But laughter and humor, even in those moments of danger and fear and terror, becomes a way that people coped and dealt with life behind the veil. As Hughes' simple recounts in Chips on the Shoulder, no matter how much he may wish otherwise, he cannot escape being a black man in America. During the Jim Crow era, that meant race framed his existence. When his friend invites him to talk about something other than race, simple counters, I will not. He continues, and suppose I did. There's always some chip to weigh a colored shoulder down. The chips were the actual and metaphorical hurts that accumulated over a lifetime. Those hurts led to self-doubt and self-recrimination, alienation and frustration, alcoholism and drug use, abuse and violence. A generation later, we would label them anxiety disorders and depression. Black Americans called them the blues and turned the pain into a musical art form whenever possible. But whether called the blues or chips on the shoulder, life behind the veil produced another chapter in the history of doing more than simply surviving in America. This talk begins a look into the ways in which African Americans mobilize humor as a survival and empowerment tool and shows the importance and the limits of that tool. This talk seeks to open for new scrutiny the way race revealed and obscured our understanding of social relations. More than anything, it invites scholars of the African American experience to begin looking at mental health as an important area of historical scholarship, suggesting that jokes and humor-laced stories hint at underexplored aspects and effects of life behind the veil. Thank you. Thank you for the last 3 days of attendance, questions, and colleagueship. It has been my distinct honor and pleasure to give this installment of the Nathan Huggins Lectures. It has also served as a valuable reintroduction to a role that I abandoned a few years ago, that of professor. As I finalize my plans to return to the University of Michigan, these days will loom large for some time. Thank you.
Wow, Earl, that was beautiful, and the ending was so moving. This is a hard-ass crowd, man. They clap longer than they clap for anybody. This is really wonderful. Questions, comments, and you can just call on people. The one source I want to give you, I gave to Danielle once she was talking about the history of anti-slavery. There's this funny little book from 1688 called The Negro and Indians Advocate by Morgan Godwin. Okay. Who was a minister in Virginia. He was English, in 1680. And he said, he's summarizing the debate over whether Africans, people of African descent, were human beings. And he says, we know they're human beings because of risibility and discourse, because they can laugh. Mm-hmm. And I found that really, just out of the blue. Of course, you could trace that back to Aristotle, the sort of theory of laughter, I guess. But it's just interesting. These Negroes laugh, so they have to be human beings. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing.
Yeah. No, and then, you can almost imagine, right, Langston Hughes sitting there working on the simple characters, and how do you begin to really poke fun at all the things you see, the headlines you read, the stories that accumulate, and who is that? Almost, it's not even quite ventriloquy, where someone, though, can verbalize what's there and pull it together in a way, because you also have this counterpoint. You have the character, the friend, who's challenging and pushing, and so I'm gonna put you back in your lane, man. And then he veers out again. And those moments of laughter, and yeah, from the very beginning, laughter, 17th century down through.
Do you worry that these traditions like simple
Yeah.
are being lost to our kids? My colleagues and I put them in the North End anthology,
Yeah.
right? And then people write biographies of Hughes, but that the tradition is being lost.
I actually do worry about that piece and where you find a way to step back and laugh in a way where it doesn't have to be profane to get to the laughter, where you don't have to set it up in such a way that using every word that we always use on a playground, because there's this way in which Hughes was actually looking at some ways the profanity of a certain kind of aspect of Jim Crow life without actually in a way that everyone could go get into it. And do we have the various media today that will allow people to produce a simple kind of character? Absolutely. Do we have people who are prepared to do it? And what would it do? What would it look like? I mean, in the days where all black newspapers and a certain kind of black media were so prominent, and I can still remember my grandfather would pick up his check on Friday afternoon, and he would do two things. Three things. He would come and hand most of the money to my grandmother, go to the ABC store and buy himself a pint, and then pick up a Jet.
Oh yeah.
Jet magazine. And so there are ways in which that generation and that followed from the 1940s into the 1980s, there was a way of behaving that has changed with the proliferation of more sources, which means then, is there potential? Yes. Will it look the same? Probably not. Is there a need for it? No question.
But those things were hallmarks of a culture.
Yeah.
No
question about it.
The habits that bind to people, that make a culture a culture.
Well, and full of all the contradictions there too, right?
Sure.
I mean, and that's the piece that I think where people can recognize when to laugh and how to laugh, because I mean, where do you learn those cues? How do you know which lines in a Langston Hughes in a simple story is the ones you actually should laugh at versus the ones that you read over and pause? So how do you learn that? And what are those habits? And those are the questions and the opportunities I think we in the Academy get to sort of highlight, and those out there who are producing a new generation of cultural products get to think about.
Can we want to call on people?
John had his hand up, and then I think Danielle.
So I appreciate the third installment of your lecture series. I'd like you to talk more about the analysis in the humor. And if I understood the exchange you just had with Skip, I think that has persisted. If you think about Richard Pryor moving to Eddie Murphy, moving to Chris Rock, if you've seen them on stage, they're analyzing the culture, they're analyzing racism, they're making us laugh about it, but they're extremely insightful. And there was, I saw an article recently that there's a drum roll anticipating how Chris Rock is going to treat Trump. Nobody's really treated Trump on the stage, as at least I don't think so, and that article didn't think so. But that is still there, the analytical content of the humor. And
I agree with that.
I'm not sure how much. Why do you think it's been lost?
Well, I mean, what I thought in the days when Langston was creating Simple, there was a Friday installment that came with the weekly production of the Chicago Defender and others. So it was not just one time, but it was there. And so the difference between a Chris Rock or Eddie Murphy or David Chappelle and others is that you either need to be at their performance or you need to actually see them on some loop on television, rather than the weekly sort of version of actually having this produced and reproduced throughout communities. And so it's much more about frequency. Not that there aren't moments and you can't pull out signs and examples, but the frequency where you knew if you wouldn't get your paper on Friday, you're going to get some version of this that was going to allow you to laugh until the next week, versus then waiting for your occasion where one of the comments comes through your town, because at the same time, I mean, I didn't go into Mom's Mabley, but you have Mom's Mabley and Pigmeat Market and all of them coming through too, but they were on a circuit, and you had to be part of the circuit of going to listen to them in what was the old Chitlin circuit for black entertainers in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. They offered a different version of it. I just chose the one that was more accessible, assuming you had a nickel or a dime to get yourself a newspaper and somebody who could read it for you.
And then you could read the paper too at the barbershop.
Yeah, I could read it at the barbershop, and you sit, and also it's more, John, it was more not that there aren't examples. It's just, are there forms now that allow it for a certain kind of humor and critique to circulate more widely? I mean, you can almost say in a more democratic form. And that's the question I was sort of posing. Danielle and then Adam.
So thank you. I really enjoyed that. And I guess I'm a sort of cusp generation person, right? Right between this generation and the hip hop generation. And so I grew up with Simple on my parents' bookshelves.
Yeah.
And so I can testify to the experience of the child who sort of picks it up and like doesn't know how to make sense of it. Like kind of gets it's different. Something's going on, and just like over the years, the humor coming into view. So, and it took a long time. It took like probably 10 years of my like drifting by those pages and coming back to them and sort of teasing them and so forth. So I just wanted to say thank you as well for your beautiful readings of the specific moments of humor. So the Thurgood Marshall example and the father whose son has died, because it's sort of, I've thought a little bit about tragicomic aesthetic in the context of Ellison, and always my first instinct has been to go to the kind of structural analysis, the sort of social political analysis, and that's there. But you've done this beautiful thing of showing us, sort of texture of emotional life and the way in which like different places of emotions kind of rub against each other in different directions, right? Like the hurt, the pride, the grief, the charity to like this guy. He's not going to be in his face rude. He's just like, whatever, like here he goes again. I'll just, and then let him know what's going on. But, and that's really subtle and important because it does open up the mental health conversation in a way that I think there hasn't been enough space for. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. I think it's really super helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Adam.
I thought it was fascinating, and the general argument is one of using humor as a weapon to fight back against oppression.
Yeah.
The thing that intrigues me is whether there's a usefulness to think through of humor in a much more complex way.
Yeah.
Are there different types of humor?
Oh, yeah.
And do different political traditions reflect different types of humor? Now, I don't have an answer to this, but I wonder, when we were speaking about humor in your conversation with Skip, you were talking about it as a generational question. Yeah. What existed 50 years ago, what exists now? Are we losing something 50 years ago? What I'd love to know is, in the period of the 60s, when we had different political traditions, even today, do they manifest humor in different ways?
Yeah.
And is there some reflection on that? Do the Black Power movement reflect it and engage in it in a slightly different way to others, and why and how, and what does that mean? And I thought that would be a useful reflection a little.
Yeah, so I was saying to a few people, either last night or the night before now, so it's starting to run together. Some of you may have seen this documentary that Whoopi Goldberg did on Mom's Mabley a couple of years ago. And part of this has to do with political context and social change. So one of the more poignant moments in that documentary is when there's a scene where Mom's Mabley is on the show with Merv Griffin. And Merv, for those who are not American residents, was this TV host that seemed to last for decades. You turn him on in the middle of the day, and that was Merv. So it's circa 1967, 68. And Mom's is on the show. And it's one of my favorite moments. So Merv looks at Mom. She's sitting there, and she looks like this bag lady, right, in her stage costume. And Merv says, "Mom, I understand you've been down south a whole lot, and there's all this stuff going on. So what's it like?" And so you can almost see Mom's going, "I really want to tell this man something, but they're the censors. How do I get around the censors?" So she looked at him, and you could almost see this little twinkle in her eye. And she says, "Well, Merv, those folks down south really like their horses and all. You know, they really like that TV cowboy guy. And so Murph doesn't realize he's being played, and he goes, you mean Roy Rogers? She says, oh, yeah, baby, Roy Rogers. She says, and he really liked Roy's horse. You know, what's that horse's name? And what's that horse's name? And and Murph goes, you mean Trigger? And she said, yeah, because everywhere I go, all I hear is Trigger, Trigger, Trigger. And Murph, like, it takes him a second, and you can see on his face, there's like this 3-second delay. And he go, oh, but you realize the brilliance of Mums Mabley, because she wanted to make a point, and she knew that most of the people, including Murph, would get it. But if she used the word that she wanted to use, it would have been bleeped out. And she didn't. And in fact, that whole segment in those days would have. And so in a way, is actually thinking about that generation, because I argue that Mums Mabley represented the end of one generation of black comics in the United States. Richard Pryor comes in at a different moment, and where the censors change and what you could say in public, what you could get away with saying. I mean, what you could get in certain clubs you could say, but you couldn't say it on TV. By the 80s, you could actually begin to say it on TV. And it begins, that too is part of this change. And if you begin to sort of look, but if you have an opportunity, go listen, I think it was HBO Showtime documentary. You get a little sense of Mums Mabley as an entertainer, as a comic, and what she went through. And what in earlier generation, what it meant to even fashion yourself as a comic. And believing you could comment on and critique American life in that way. I think, Adam, to your larger question, there are several things at play here. And genius actually, has its own forms of materializing at different times. And certainly there are different societal contexts, because you have to use signposts to reference things in shorthand. And if people don't understand those signposts, they certainly won't get the joke. And so you have to think then, too, about that context and whether a signpost in one generation will make sense in another, or to Danielle's point about her childhood, what a 5-year-old or 7-year-old will understand is not the same thing as a 17-year-old, let alone a 37-year-old. And so that, too, is the nature of humor and the stories. And for those of us of a certain age, you always realize when your parents will sometimes send you out of the room as a child, because the adults will have conversation that meant something different.
Here's a tiny little footnote real fast. The thing that confused me the most as a kid was why he was called Simple.
Oh.
I was so confused.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's working. Is it working? Thank you so much again. I mean, I had enjoyed this significantly.
Thank you.
Really a mind blower all the way. I like to respect, at least pay respect to someone who recently died, Dick Gregory.
Yes.
Who is like really one of the people that really got the new generations really motivated. And one thing, I got to see him at BC a few years back when he was in his prime. And one of the things that he illustrated was the ability of comedy to not only be a weapon, but also to be a shield. Yeah. And he got into a situation where he was in the South trying to desegregate a lunch counter or something like that. And he was sitting there. He had managed at that time to get a chicken served. And apparently someone called the cops or whatever it is, the powers to be, and they came in really aggressively to him. And basically say, with a few spikes of the N-word, whatever you do to that chicken, we will do to you. You remember that? Yeah. And then he looked at the chicken. He said he was really hungry, and he kissed the chicken.
Yeah, I mean, it is that ability, though. I mean, over the last 3 days, what I try to remind myself in writing through this, and Susan and I were having this conversation, there was this whole arsenal that people use at various times to deal with situations. And some were smarter and quicker than others to pull out the right tool at the right time. And so that use of humor at that moment and the ability to kiss the chicken was a way to signify more than one thing and can disarm, right? I mean, as a kid, one of my great aunts who was a domestic and didn't even have a high school education. And I can still remember her coming in one day, and she was just laughing. And I'm sitting in my grandparents' house, and I'm going, "So, Aunt Martha, what's so funny?" And she said, "Oh, I got to tell you this story." And she sort of tells this joke, right? And this is this way, and it's the Jim Crow South is early 1960s in Virginia. But it's a joke about a police officer who pulls up a black person, a woman, who has run through a traffic light. And the police officer comes and says, "Ma'am, may I see your papers and your slips and all?" And so the slip becomes then a way of disarming the police officer. He says, "What do you mean you want to see my slip? Don't you have any respect?" No man should ask that of a woman. And by the time she tells the story, the police officer is so flustered, he just gives up. I mean, and he's like, "Okay, I don't want to deal with this lady anymore. I had enough. I mean, I don't know what she's into, and she may be a little crazy, and I don't have time to write up crazy this afternoon." And all. But it was those stories that circulated too. I mean, so when Dick Gregory tells that story, he's not only telling it for his own benefit, but also for anyone else who finds himself at that lunch counter in a similar situation. How do you disarm? And what are the ways in which you can actually move out of one space that's really tight and come out as whole and as human as possible? Martha.
Yes, this has been just wonderful 3 days,
Yeah.
I have to say. I've written as a linguist about these things from a language perspective.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've written about is laughter,
Yeah.
women's laughter. And I call it signifying laughter. And I think what has always amazed me about it is the way the sort of African American speech community hears the laughter,
Yeah.
and how other communities don't hear it at all.
Exactly.
And if they hear it, they see it as, why would they think that's funny?
Yeah.
As opposed to it being a comment
Yeah.
on, or a judgment. And I was once working on a project, just to show you how basic this is, for the CDC on low infant mortality, et cetera. And we were talking to people about, interviewing them about dietary possibilities. And so the move was to introduce mangoes, okay, to this black population. It was called a black population, but it's a completely Caribbean population. And so they said, and they don't eat mangoes. And I was like, so, but when they did the questioning and said, "Do you know what a mango is?" the women would laugh.
Yeah.
And so it became more and more, what's wrong with these women? We
Yeah.
must really work so they understand what a mango is.
Yeah.
And it was, so the laughter is such a powerful thing. And I just wanted to mention.
No, I appreciate that. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's that ability to actually sometimes for historians going back and looking at the record and trying to figure out in that moment, what are you actually seeing? Because earlier you could actually misread that whole moment as somehow read through the lens of the person asking the question rather than the person who's hearing the question and realize, all right, this is sort of silly. I mean, I'm from Caribbean roots. I know something about mangoes and other kinds of tropical fruits, but it's that piece I actually realize is both the fun and the difficult part.
This is about power.
It's very much about power.
You want support. And so do you.
Well, I mean, it's both about, I think it's absolutely about power. And it's also about the arrogance of power. I mean, that is, in some ways, my perception of the world is the framing perception of the world. And that I'm going to slot you into that way the world has been framed and the way that world should be framed. It was brought home to me in a different context, in a different way. Years ago when I was still in Michigan, I once had a group of folks in Detroit who came in, and I was dean of the graduate school, and I had, there were 19 schools and colleges, 15 of the other 19 deans. and we were going to meet with community folks in Detroit. And then finally someone looked at them and says, I'm tired of you guys coming in and studying us. Here are the new terms. If you want to come into Detroit to work, we're going to be the co-author of the studies. My name's going to be on that article too. And then I'm going to help to design what it looks like. This is true community participation and engagement. If you, and all of a sudden, the conversation, you can imagine now, right? 15 deans sitting around the table and people in the community saying that we're going to wrest away the power. Up until now, you defined the terms of engagement. We're going to redefine the terms of engagement, and we're going to expect to be the co-authors of these studies. That was a moment. It's the same thing in a way where these women are responding. I know more about this than you do, dear. And I can do it with a nod and a wink and a laugh, and I can tell you not only about a mango, but I can tell you a few things other about mangoes, but probably not on your question sheet. It's that piece that I think for scholars and academics, our ability to imagine then the people that have been interviewed and we will work with as the co-authors of our studies. And what would that tell us about the ways in which we interpret the work? But thank you for that insight. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you very much. I'm constantly translating things
Yes.
Relating to the African tradition,
Yes.
particularly West Africa. And as I listened to the lecture, I sort of was thinking about humors in the context of rituals.
Yes.
And the reason why it has so much impact, significance, is that it is tied to their cosmogonic stories. That was a question that Max Gluckman missed when he wrote his book, Rituals of Protest. And because it's so tied to the cosmogonic myth and their stories of their origin, so it has this very strong presence. And those who are, in fact, abused in the context of it sort of disappeared. The kings, the chiefs will run away because they are very fearful of the impact of these rumors and these lampooning songs. So I'm wondering how we can sort of project that into this, because as we were telling the stories and citing the encounters of African Americans with the police and the attempt to get out of this whole mess, my mind sort of kind of revert back to that original, that West African tradition where it has this connection. The second has to do with the first part of the lecture on the animals.
Yeah.
Till today, the story, of course, is that we are so much into it. Either in terms of totem, there's no African, West Africa, that doesn't have a totem animal. And so it has a different meaning when it is cited or is used or discussed. So I'm trying to think about this connection and relationship because you beautifully describe what it was during that particular period. Is it a carryover? Well, of course it's a carryover, but does it have that kind of significance? For example, there's a tradition of Oriki, where it's not just enough to greet you, but they have to recite almost stories of your origin. And half of the sentence, half of the whole thing, look at the paragraph, relates to the animals. The son of the great hunter, or the son of the leopard, and that kind of stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for both of those questions. Clearly, we think about rituals, and rituals actually get introduced in a way. I made a glancing reference to playing the dozens. For those of us who grew up, certainly in my part of the South in 1950s and 60s on the playgrounds, that's where you learned the nature of ritual. Because the verbal sparring games that often ended in the phrase your mama realized that, and depending on how you ended that, it was either a fist fight or you had won. And your adversary was like, okay, I'm not going to deal with this guy today. I'm going to go on. But it's that ability, sort of thinking about humor in its ritualized forms has different variations across the globe, and I don't know enough about how to think about both in the various African contexts in the U.S. and what's changed, but it sounds like a worthy research project. We can talk about that a little bit afterwards. I mean, as for how we deal with humor, and particularly dealing with humor in particular settings, I mean, going back to Dick Gregory with those cops in lunch counter and somewhere in the South in the 1950s, early 60s, is one setting, right? If you're driving in your car and you have a police officer confronting you and you're trying to keep your hands clear and you're not making a sudden movement of any kind, that probably humor or anything else is not the right answer at that moment. I mean, we have enough hard video right now. And years ago, I remember being taught when I was a graduate student. I used to study police, actually. I had a side job, a second job for a crime prevention company, and we studied criminal behavior and all. And we worked with police, and the head of the Minneapolis police force at that point said to me, the most dangerous thing on the road anywhere in the world is a rookie cop and a rookie crook, because one of them is going to make a move in a way that's going to end up someone getting shot. And I've retained that for a long, long time about what are gestures you can make and where's the right setting for making those gestures. And so Gregory's really deep calculation to say, in this setting, what will work? And my ability to go and kiss that chicken will work. In other settings where we're seeing guns pulled or folks thrown through the ground, it's not clear that gesture would work. And so then you have to pull something else out of the repertoire of tools to actually try to figure out how to de-escalate the situation. And that remains one of the ongoing challenges, I think, around, certainly in the U.S. And in a way, I actually think more of our police force actually should learn a little bit about humor. Because it may allow then a human connection to be made before the brain begins to say there's a threat. And so part of what we know from a certain amount of literature and research, right, is that people see threats because they have learned certain social scripts over a lifetime that says that person is likely to be more dangerous than another person. And we can simulate this now. I mean, if you think of what virtual reality work can do, we can simulate situations for every police officer in the United States. And we can test them to see what they see in certain settings. And perhaps we can re-educate them to see different things if we were willing to make that kind of investment. But in the interim, you also have to, and it goes back to yesterday's lecture, you have parents teaching teaching children how and what will work in a given setting. And I would say, in certain settings, I think I don't know where we'll find a moment to kiss the chicken, and because we're dealing with something else right now. The last thing I would say about humor, and this is the other part, and I think about all of the lectures, all three of the lectures tied together. From the end of the 19th century, from the creation of institutions like Central State, and you realize, from my records, I have the records of 4,528 individuals who were committed to this institution from the end of the 19th century to circa 1900. Those were men and women and children who, I know names and ages and dates and something about how they were employed, but there's so much more about how they got there and why these institutions were created and they endure. We know, going into yesterday's lecture about the era of Jim Crow, that people had to come up with ways to ensure that they didn't all end up in Central State. And this was sort of part of the story too, that life was always difficult. And Skip and I had this little repartee about the ways in which we created this notion about supermen and superwomen. Folks were struggling throughout, but life struggle was not the only thing they were about. And so how we capture all of that, and then humor's place in all of this, And so, at least for these 3 lectures, and then I try to imagine a body of work for other scholars to also work on and begin to think through, is how and in what way we began to think through what the historical record tells us and what we imagine it should be telling us. Because in some cases, Nancy was asking me to speculate the other day, and in some cases we have to speculate because the answer is not absolutely clear. We have fragments of fragments. And for someone who was trained as a social historian who counted a whole lot of things and used to be able to discern patterns and run various regression analysis and a whole other ways to see if we can distinguish, is also getting comfortable with what we don't know. So with that, last question.
Oh, sure. I don't want to.
And then I'll thank you.
Well, thank you for an extraordinary talk. I have a short, I'll keep the question short. I wonder what your historical perspective allows you to perhaps speculate or consider about our contemporary moment as it relates to race, humor, and the digital comment. And are not allowed to bring your cell phone, right, any longer because for obvious reasons. But the other side of the spectrum is what prompts the question. Many of my students, for example, are fascinated by what's now called digital blackface, effectively the disproportionate use of black bodies to convey in humorous way social critique, right? So whether it's an image of Oprah sort of shrieking that everyone's got a car, right, as a way to convey excitement. You see this also an asymmetry between who's using these gifts and the bodies that they're choosing to express emotion. So I wonder, because this makes me think about democracy and the digital commons, I wonder what the historical perspective allows you to see about the current moment. Is it, so if you could.
Yeah, so I know we've been taped, and I'm going to say something, but there's an interesting way where we've actually, I think we've entered a new era of minstrelsy, and that we have modernized the minstrel character in one form or another. So you get those memes, and you sort of put it on, and it seems in some ways quaint and sometimes vicious, and sometimes a way to say something that is not just borderline racist, it's downright racist because it's trying to actually convey something about someone who we know has a person, and we know they're a fully embodied person, and this is what they look and say and do otherwise. But we have the Weeping Michael or Oprah, or we have LeBron or someone else that we take and we repackage for broader consumption, right? And so you end up questioning, what is this all about? And then, as a few people in this room know, even at the highest levels of our government, minstrelsy sort of shows up, right? And so we end up with political figures who mimic certain aspects of minstrelsy, from painting their skin and the white eyes and lips to the words they use and the language and that comes out, and where they actually use old racial tropes and others to convey something to a broader set of audiences. And this is a way in which we find ourselves dealing with old forms modernized, and then you get to then what the digital media allows you. Says, indeed, it is a commons. It can be quite democratic. It can also be something less than that. And so I remember, my son's 26, so this is at least 10, 12 years ago. I was listening in on him. He was playing a video game. And I said, who are you playing with? He says, oh, some kids in Germany and Sweden and wherever else in the world. I'm listening. I said, okay, they're all communicating in English, but the words that come out are all racist. And he said, yep. I said, what do you do? He said, I critique them all the time, but I said, so where are these kids from all over the world in this virtual sort of world playing video games learn all of these words? And how do they take this flat character on the screen and assign attributes to them that could have taken them to the 1940s or the 1950s and all? So what is it about this democratic space that comes with a certain level of anonymity and that empowers people to harness not always the best enough in us, but the old aspects of the worst in us, and then they reproduce it in a way that is no longer bound by nation,
and where anyone who has access to the means to be online at that point and wants to jump into that game can actually voice his or her thoughts about the world. So I actually have, for a better part of 15, 20 years, been trying to suggest that as we move into this and think through that democratic space, that you and others and your students be mindful not only of the sort of pulling of the old tropes, but actually how they get modernized and what that then tells about a new way of educating a world about universal humanity versus privileged humanity. And that's our challenge and our opportunity. Thank you.
Earl, you've done Nathan Huggins proud. Let's thank Earl Lewis for a marvelous series of lectures. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you.
Great job.
Yep.